are going to carry over into this lecture. So remember, first it's the celebration of industrialized materials, the idea that form follows function, and then lastly, this idea that we have a social reform agenda. And when you think about it, it would make sense that they're trying to go larger and larger, because when you have a social reform agenda, you're trying to change the entirety of a society, which obviously these architects know they cannot do for the singular building. So what you're going to see is that a lot of the buildings we've looked at already in this modernist era are really just really tiny fragments that play a part of a bigger scheme. So Corbu, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Kahn, all of them have these individual buildings that they never just saw as a singular building, they saw it as a part of what could have been a larger master plan. So you're going to see their ideas taken to a whole new scale. Many times they're not going to work, sometimes they will work. But the reason why we had all of this reform agenda, and especially in the modern, the urban realm, was because this is the way that people were living largely in the 19th century. So first, up on top, we have a 9 to 12-year-old girl hauling coal on her back, right? So she's probably going to die before she even reaches the age of 20, either from lung disease, she probably is going to have back problems. So the exploitation of children, especially of little girls, was something very prevalent. We also have lots of pollution in these big cities. This is in the 1950s in London. You couldn't see anything. So if you were driving, you couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. Lots of accidents, people getting run over. We also have tenement housing up on the top. So we have this huge problem of overpopulation of people in these urban cities, and we just don't have anywhere to put them. So if you've ever heard about the Gilded Age of the United States, when immigrants and people from Europe were largely coming into the large cities to get jobs, they typically had to end up living in places like this, overcrowded, and lastly, lots of diseases, right? So this is the world that these modernists have grown up in, and because of that, they are in search of what the new world would look like, especially after World War II. So largely, modernist urban planning is going to directly react to those couple things we just saw, and because of that, we're going to have, number one, increased detailed visions of the particulars of the city. So what you'll notice is that they don't just plan out where the streets should be, they tell you exactly how you should live your lives. So what time should you wake up, where should you go eat breakfast, where are you going to leave your car. They're super, super detailed because they don't want anything to go overseen, because they understand that in those cities that they're usually living in, the city planners, governments aren't necessarily concerned with their day-to-day life, and because of that, that's why all of these things are happening, because they're not paying attention to it. They're just doing larger scale projects like opera houses, maybe a big road, but they're not really concerned about the everyday lives of the people. Number two, green spaces, which is a huge reaction to all of the industry that's coming into the cities. And number three, reconsidering the fundamentals of society, economically and culturally. So this is kind of going back to those first 3 points, the social agenda. In this case, you're going to see economic, of course, because of the way that they're restructuring how the working class should live in the city. And then culturally, how can we all live in a city where we are equal, right? How can we have all these different groups come together in a way that doesn't feel like there's a strong hierarchy? So we're going to be looking at 6 different plans today. They are going to be more or less chronological, so you can see how thoughts have evolved over this kind of modernist era. We're going to start with this one, Tony Garnier. So Tony Garnier was a part of that traditional school of art and architecture, and he presented this city industrial, what his vision, his utopian vision of industrial city could be, as one of his projects at school, and he was almost kicked out because of it, because it was considered so blasphemous and ugly and non-architectural. But you're going to see that this particular plan, it might look a little outdated, but it's really going to help set the foundation for all the other city plans we're going to look at today. So just to give you an idea of what the city is, it's usually going to be built on a hill, right? So on the top is where the people are going to live. Lower down the slope is where the industry is going to be, and then you're going to have some kind of dam to have hydroelectric power. So even at the tail end of the 19th century, we are thinking about how can we have greener energy sources, because again, they understand that using coal and using all of these traditional energy sources is really nasty, and that's the reason their cities are so dirty. So here's a better separate. So you are not having any kind of factories, jobs, production where people are living. And notice that hospitals, in particular, their own district, all the way at the top of that hill. Why are hospitals there? Because at the time it was believed that fresh air could cure a number of diseases like tuberculosis, a lot of breathing diseases at the time, could be solved, they believed, through just having fresher air, which in turn is true, but it was also caused by other things that they didn't quite understand yet. Up here we have our dam where it records hydroelectric power, which is really advanced for the time, because even today there is a lot of pushback against using hydroelectric power. But again, this is why he almost got kicked out of art school, because he was proposing all of this. We have an old town, a more historic district, so he proposed when visitors came over, they could arrive in this old town right next to the stations, they could train ride, see what people are living in the new city, they could go visit what a model industrial center could look like. So this is what he envisions the dots, right? So in this industrial corridor, he does have water in order to connect not just with rail, but also through steam power, through steamboats to outright. And notice how detailed all of this is, right? He even places every column on the dock. He really puts a lot of emphasis on how our industrial workers are going to be living here. Notice he even has a shade cover over some of those boats when they're working on them. So this is what I mean when we're talking about the particulars of the city. He doesn't just put it out on a plan and say this is where the industry is. He actually sketches out all of it and he tells us this is my vision for what the world could look like. So very organized. It reads a lot cleaner than industry in, contemporary cities of its day. These would be the furnaces, which was still very, very heavily industrial. They probably wouldn't be this clean for very long, but you do have this emphasis on the human skill, right? Giving people these bridges, these smaller stations to work in. So it's a little bit more organized, but again, this is just the first step before we get to those other plants. So it still looks a little too industrial. This is our old town and our station. So notice how the station looks kind of like 1950s, right? So if you watch Cars, it kind of looks like something out of that movie. So he is moving a little bit towards a different language, right? With these huge cantilevers, these huge clock towers. There is a callback to the traditional railway station with its big tower and its clock. But notice that it's all industrial, and he doesn't try to hide it on the fronts like we saw that they did during the Industrial Revolution, right? And lastly, the most radical part, and this is really the reason why he almost got kicked out of art school, is how he proposed people should live. So inside of his residential quarters, he proposes we should have these prefabricated tilt-up structures, right? Which is largely how we're building our workhouses today. So they're made out of reinforced concrete, you just pour it in and you get this multitude of homes that has south-facing windows. He proposes that less than 50% of the area in orange is going to be actual building, meaning most of it is just going to be gardens, parks, green spaces for people to access. I forgot to skip to the end. But the point is that he's really emphasizing having nature woven into the fabric of the city, which is something that we haven't really seen before. Up until this point, the way that people thought about nature and parks was just you put one in the center of the city and people walked in it. But in this version of it, you can see he even has plants along the top, planters, they are all integrated into the architecture. Everyone gets a window in their bedroom facing south, so you get ventilation in there, so you have clean air to breathe. And this is something that people hadn't really thought about before. But the idea of living in a structure made of concrete that wasn't hidden, it wasn't plotted, it was just left exposed, was something that was shocking to a lot of people at the time. And now it's like the most sought after material, polished modern concrete. There's another vision of what that looks like. Notice a lot of it is low rise, right? So it's also a reaction against high rise towers and what was going on in Paris and London at the time. They kept it more human scale, something that felt more like an actual neighborhood. Alright, so this kind of leads us into our second C, which is going to be by the Corb. So remember, Corb is the guy who says you need low T's, free facade, free plan, roof plan. He's the one that pretty much has all of the white boxes that are floating up on the T's. So now we're going to see what Corb thought of as being the perfect city. Park is very extremist in many cases, and we're going to see that in the city planning. This is a small view of a terrace looking out into what he considers the city should look like. So you can see it's low density and high density all at the same time, right? So low density in the sense that we don't really have building next to building next to building. A high density in the fact that all of it's concentrated on these enormous, enormous towers. And we just don't have an in-between park and then tower. And that is what it's been called a lot of times. Parks or towers in a park concept. All right, so this is generally what the city looks like. It is a city for 3 million, which he considers a perfect size, which is roughly the size of Las Vegas right now, right? And you can see that it is a whole geometrically shaped place. Obviously, when cities develop organically, they're not going to look like this. So he is a proponent for starting from scratch. Starting from scratch either in somewhere that's never been developed or starting from scratch by bulldozing a whole city. So what are the different districts? Number one, in the red, has the little capitalist zone. So all of those little cruciform shapes that you see are big, big towers, the ones you just saw on the last slide. And this is where all of business is going to be conducted. So he calls this kind of like the brains of the city, white collar workers. Then in the yellow, he says this is the cultural centers. If you want to go to the theater, if you want to go to a opera, a show, if you want to go to university, you would probably go to the yellow district. In the blue is going to be our kind of mid-rise housing, which we're going to look at right now. So if you're kind of wealthy, you can live in the blue. Then he has a park, which you see he puts off to the side, which is already a difference from what we saw with Tony Marquez, where the park was everywhere. In this case, he is segregating it over to one side. And then in the purple is the general housing where everyone else is going to live. But keep in mind, all of those little lines, you see the zigzags, those zigzags are the building. They're not the outline of the building, okay? So people are living in the actual black lines that you see in here. So this is what it looks like, just for context. So we have donut buildings, and then we have these big zigzag buildings, which you see are infinite and just keep on going forever. And then we have our central business district in the center. So it's kind of like a traditional city in some ways, where you have the center be the tallest, you know, your downtown has the biggest skyscrapers, and then it kind of gets lower and lower from there. But it's also different because of the density issue, right? So notice that it's the least dense in this area over here, where you have the most people working in these towers. And so his concept was, yes, there's a whole separate park that is unobstructed, but also he has the whole bottom floor be open. And remember, one of Park's concepts was you lift the skirt of the building up and then you add pilotis so that you can walk under the building like there's nothing there. So he says, what if we put all of these towers on stilts and you can walk from one end to the other across the city unobstructed? You don't have to walk around blocks or any type of building. You can just walk underneath them. So this is what he imagines it would look like. Another thing to know about modernist city planning is the car was becoming a huge deal at this time, and they didn't really see it as an evil thing just yet. So they believed the car was the future, and because of that, there was a lot of emphasis on road infrastructure for cars. So you're going to see we have these huge, huge roads, which would definitely be opposed to today. So this is one of those towers. Every single one of these lines is a floor, right? So lots of floors, so that all of your white-collar workers can go work there. Now, if you notice, in the plan, there wasn't really a place for industry. There wasn't really a place for our factories. So although it is a reaction against the industrial city, Corp doesn't really fix the issue of where do we put all of our industrial workers. So he actually proposes that they shouldn't be in the city. They should be out in the countryside on these other kind of plants. So that tells you what his vision of industry is. So you can see a little bit, right? These are our little floaties right here. And notice that they look so tiny next to all of this. And the idea is, again, that you can walk underneath that whole building from side to side unobstructed. Along the whole bottom, you're going to have plazas, some trees. So it's kind of like an infinite park, and then you have a whole separate park going on. And then you have these huge roadways. And the way that he positions these roads is actually probably one of the most interesting parts about this scheme, because they're actually floating. So he proposes that car highways be on the 7 permeate the entirety of the city on this elevated level. So if you want to get from your house to where you work, you're going to take a highway that's 8 stories high. So you arrive on the 8th level, you park there, and then no cars are ever on the ground floor. So you're essentially liberating it and giving it back to the people in the form of greenery or a park. And in theory, that kind of works because you allow the pedestrians on the bottom to not have to worry about car traffic or any noise, but it also really alienates people from this new machine. So it creates this kind of hierarchy of levels that doesn't always work. It's a very 19th century idea to separate your flow of traffic. Has anyone here ever been to Central Park in New York City? So you know how there's like these roads that go underneath the park and there's these bridges? And you have to really lean over to look at the cars underneath. So that's a 19th century idea that you separate the forms of traffic. And again, it works because you are protecting pedestrians, but it really doesn't contribute to making it feel like a neighborhood. As you're driving, you're kind of just isolated on a road with more cars, and you don't see anything but cars as you're up there. So it has its pros and cons. Some people like it, some people don't. So the bulk of the housing is going to be these donuts, which is going to look like this. So right now we're going to get down to the individual unit scale. Keep in mind that there are hundreds of these donuts in the city, and each one of these has hundreds of little units inside of it, which he proposes are going to look like this. So this is what he did for $1 billion in 1925. So it's a little home. Just ignore the little round part over there, it's not a part of it. But this is what he thinks of as being a modular unit that you can just slide into these blocks. And what it has is a 2-story loft right here, right? So that way you have a 2-story outdoor balcony right next to it. So every unit needs an outdoor area that is private. And then if we go back to the scheme, all of these units collectively share that outdoor area in the center. So there's this concept of private and public green space. And the idea that having public green space just isn't enough. You have to have a private space in your home that has greenery. And in this case, he's added a little hole and put a tree there. So if we close up and zoom into the facade of one of those donut buildings, it would look like this, which we can then break apart into these grid formations. And from there, Photoshop it on, you could have one of these units on each one of these, right? So you can just slide in a single family residence into one of these, and it has a backyard technically, right? It has a view to the outdoors, it has shared amenities. So Corbu believes that the answer to the industrialized city isn't necessarily to make it less dense. In fact, it's more dense. Right now you have 10, 15-story blocks to live in. But the answer is just to incorporate greenery into that density. The second form of housing he has are the little zigzags. So again, these are the actual building blocks, and they just go on forever. And that's really his point in building them. He wants them to be infinite zigzags, where you can live over on this end, right here, and then you can just walk all the way to this end. And within these buildings, you would have your shops, your markets, your banks, everything you could possibly need would be within that same building. So imagine living out your entire life without ever leaving this whole zigzag building. It sounds nice and convenient in theory, but again, that's not the way people live most of their lives. So ultimately, this was never really going to work. But I'm going to show you an example of a building he made that would fit into this scheme. So this is a view, right? So that's kind of the outline, just so you can see it a little bit better. So we have this infinite zigzag that is uncut, and then on the inside we have some sports arenas, other amenities, entertainment areas. So basically you're either in your building or you come down to this ground level, and that's it. You never have to leave within 5 minutes of where you live to have everything that you need. And you really wouldn't want to, given that it's just the same thing over and over and over in the city. There's nothing unique to each one of these blocks, so why would you ever leave your own block? That was considered in his eyes the dream of how people could live in the city. So, he constructed this building. Story behind this building. So when Germany invaded France, they had this kind of puppet government going on, and they liked Forbes' ideas because they were so almost totalitarian, right? He's telling you exactly they brought Korb onto the team, even though he was supposed to be a French patriot and be fighting against the Germans, he actually helped them out. And then once Germany was defeated, he kind of crawled back to France and apologized, and he started creating these mini buildings for them. So as France is rebuilding from World War II, they're hiring all the modernists to come in and give them, new options for people to live in high density, that are cheap, that are affordable. And Corbu creates this as, again, a form of apology for siding with the Germans for a little bit. This is called Unité d'Habitation. So it's a bunch of units, right? Very much like the last one we saw, but these are incredible units. I'll show you. They're incredible. He's a genius. So on the one end, you have this blank slate. So we're going to go back to the scene, right? Notice that the long facades where everything is going on with all the windows, the ventilation, and then on the short end is quite blank. If you didn't have the staircase here, there's really nothing there. So if you think about infinite zigzags, you could essentially take one of these and put it right next to each other and butt it up. And all you have to do is cut out hallways because there's no windows there. You're not really taking anything away. So Corbu, when he was building this structure, was already thinking about his vision of the new industrial city. And he was thinking, well, if you like it so much, maybe you'll hire me to come back, and then I can just add an addition to this end, and so forth, and create a ginormous zigzag for people to live in. This is the facade. If you notice, the facade looks a little bit different here on these upper floors. This is where shopping and retail is, right? So traditionally, you come down from your apartments, you go shop on the ground floor. In Europe, it is quite common to get your groceries every single day, get them fresh, get your bread, your meat. But in his scheme, he believed that, again, the ground floor is liberated, so there's nothing going on here. So instead, we're going to put the shops up there where the cars would be. So remember, the cars are on that 8-story highway. So as they come into the building, you could essentially drive by the shopping arcade that's up there and drop off your deliveries. People can then go up to there, they can walk around. So he puts the entirety of the function of the ground floor up in the sky. He believes people should live a more elevated lifestyle. There's that one facade. Now, one of his things was activating the roof. He loves flat roofs. Why? Because it's extra real estate. So he gives these people that live in the Unité a number of amenities on the roof, including a cabana, a pool, a clubhouse. These are seating areas over here where you could have fires. So although it looks quite brutalist and it's all made out of concrete, it's actually one of the most sought after places to live in Marseille because of all the amenities that it offers you. And a lot of people try to copy this idea because of the amount of units you could fill in, and it was cheap construction, but they always forgot to add all the amenities. So that's why when you look at places like Eastern Europe, you have these mega concrete blocks where people can live in, but they lack the amenities, which makes them look quite sad, right? And they're kind of depressing because they don't have all of the things that made this particular project a success. There's some more amenities, right? So you have eating areas out here, walking areas. Remember in his monastery, when you put a log on the top, if you were a monk, he adds this idea into the thing as well. And then in section is where this building really, really shines. So this is the way that the units work together. So all of these little squares that you see are hallways. And if you notice, the hallways are not on every floor. So they're every other floor. And the idea is you have these interlocking units like this. So you can either enter on the ground floor if you live on the red one, you enter on the ground floor, and then you have a whole floor above you. Or if you live in the blue unit, you enter on the top, and you have a whole story below you. Now, what does this do for the units? It allows you to have a green space on either side. So you have cross ventilation across the entire thing. On your double end side, you have a 2-story green space, and then on your single side, you have a balcony for your bedrooms. So this way, and you'll see the way he designs his plans is quite intuitive. If you open up the doors on both sides, you'll have wind come in through your entire unit, which feels really fresh. And this is another one of the things that the people who tried to copy forgot about. So they just did kind of run-of-the-mill basic units. You open it up, you have a single kind of door, balcony, maybe just a window. So your unit doesn't ventilate, and it doesn't really feel that nice. They didn't really follow this scheme, and that's why they didn't work. Here's a close-up of it. So again, you can see So this would be the top of one of those units down here. So notice that these bedrooms are long and skinny, right? So rather than having a big block bedroom on the end, like the way most units are built today, and then a little bedroom here with no window, he creates two bedrooms that are equal in size. They both have windows, they both have access to a balcony, and then you can easily just open up these doors. And because this is a balcony overseeing this side, you have your cross ventilation all the way across. So it's really a very genius idea that he comes up with. You also have in the yellow, where you notice that you do have these double hallways. These are just lofted. So you have that unit up there. So you essentially have a two-story apartment. So you have choices, and this is one of the new things that he does as well. He gives you options of how you want to live. Do you want to live in one of these L buildings? Do you want to live in a two-story loft building? And they're all contained within the same kind of massive unit. So although it looks quite uniform, you do get options for what lifestyle you want to pursue in this great city. This is what they look like, which is again why they are some of the most sought after places to live in. They do look very modern. They're very fresh. They have great ventilation, amazing daylight coming in from both ends. So although these are long and skinny and they only have windows at those two ends, they really maximize the daylight. There's another view of it. You can see the people that live in these places do love to curate it, to have designer furniture. So these are not people that have a super affordable lifestyle. Oftentimes they're very, posh and lofty. This is the vision for how he saw the family living during when the building was created. So notice that you can open up the entirety of that living room space, right? So it's a foldable door, you can open it up, and now you have a balcony or an outdoor backyard right next to you with a view of the city, which is a huge upgrade from living in a tenement home with 6 other families and all of their children, right? So this allows you to have clean air, so disease is eradicated. This allows you to have autonomy, liberty. It really elevates the working class to a new type of residence that they had never seen before. And because at the time people thought this was ugly, the working class was really the only types of people that lived here, or the kind of middle class. But today, it's really the upper class people that want to live in this building. Now on that arcade level I told you about on the 7th, 8th floor, where the cars would come in, this is a shopping arcade that they get. So basically, you would come down, you would have a bakery, you would have a dry cleaner, all of the things you might use in your everyday life. So you either come down from the top floor or up from the bottom floors. And you would basically walk this arcade every day and get your daily necessities. And in Corb's perfect vision of the city, you would have a highway attached to it right on the outside. So that cars can stop by, drop off deliveries, pick up deliveries, pick you up in a taxi, and take you to work. And so if, again, we Photoshop one of those units onto here, imagine if the entirety of this was just made up of these infinite facades of bonitas all the way down this entire city. One block seems really great, right? But when you think about the whole place looking that way, that's when it starts to get a little bit uneasy, which is largely why Le Corbusier's urban planning isn't really kind of a popular opinion. Now, eventually, he gets so good at this kind of reconstruction of the Paris after the World Wars, that he creates this plan for the vision of Paris. So this is that island where Notre Dame is at. Notre Dame is that kind of dark spot right there. This is the Seine River. And he decides to superimpose his plan onto the center of Paris, which is a problem because that means you have to bulldoze most of the historic district. But Corbu, like many modernists of this time, reject the historical past altogether. So he doesn't really care that they're bulldozing history. He just wants to impose this new idea. So if we put it on the modern map of Paris, this is everything that will be gone today if Corb's idea had gone through. Notice that he does salvage the Louvre right here, which is along the Seine, and then he does salvage the Opera House up here. So he does kind of carefully work around the things that he considers worthy of staying, but everything else can go. And you can see that these are super large roads compared to what Paris has. Even the larger roads in Paris, right? The roads that he's proposing are much larger. He believes it's going to clean the city with having more clean parks and trees on that ground floor. But if it had gone through, this is an artist's recreation of what it would look like if you were standing on the other side of the river. And it doesn't really look like Paris, right? It doesn't look very friendly. Because again, you have all these super high density buildings in a low density setting that really aren't friendly to the human scale. So Cord, for the most part, his biggest issue is that although he does pay attention to the particulars of the city, how you're going to live, and human lifestyle, he kind of forgets that humans need to have a human scale at all times, whether it's in the comfort of their own home or in the larger city. And you can't just give them this 20-story walk, because that's going to give people vertigo, it is not friendly, and it's just not very neighborhood-like. So these are a couple of diagrams where we can really see this essence of Le Corbusier as this hand of the architect driving how you should live your life, right? So he's creating a model over here, and oftentimes you'll see that his schemes are photographed with him manipulating them, which is very much the way that it was. He was manipulating the way that you were going to live. So this is one of those units, right, in the L shape, and he's essentially sliding into this frame of concrete. So you can just slide in these units, trade out the units, put a different unit. It was very modular. And that top image we'll get back to at the end of the lecture. But essentially, he was caught putting his hand over it, right? So the hand of the architect is dictating how you should live. So just keep that in the back of your mind for now. Now, in France, his ideas for urbanism were quite popular. They were rejected. People felt outraged that he wanted to destroy all of Paris. But in India, he actually found pretty good reception. So what was going on in India at the time was they had just become independent. So Britain eventually left India alone. And because there were several religions, different languages, even today India has several religions and languages, Britain decided that they were going to split it before they just kind of went back to their islands. The way they separated it was between Muslim areas, so there was Pakistan and what was then called East Pakistan, or is now Bangladesh, and then he left Hinduism, or they left Hinduism in India. The problem with this is it wasn't really a clean-cut line, so a lot of people did have to relocate. If you were a Muslim living within the new India, you had to leave, and so forth. So there was a lot of tension, especially in this area over here, Punjab. You had a lot of relocation going on. So Cord is called over because this new town, Chandigarh, needs a plan. So they want to really cement what their government is going to look like. This is in part of India. And they really want to create a new vision for their country. They have just become liberated. They want to emulate what's going on in the West. They want to look like a modern country, even though they've just been under colonial rule for over 100 years. So this is what he conceives, and the inspiration behind Chandigarh is the human body. So if you look at it, it kind of looks like a human, right? The head, and then its extremities, and then its legs at the bottom. But it's also conceptually arranged like the body. So at the top is the head, or the brains, and this is where the government center is going to be. This is where the city is going to be ruled from. In the center over here is the stomach, which is where you're going to have a food distribution, commercial districts, where you're going to have to go to get supplements. All of this greenery you see are the lungs. So the lungs are permeating the city, and they are essentially the green space that allows you to breathe and have clean air. Everything in the red is going to be blood vessels, arteries, the circulation of the city. So we're technically like little blood cells living in this big city. And we move between it, we feed all of these other bigger complexes. If you zoom into one of those sectors, so notice that these are kind of like big, mega rectangular blocks right here. If you zoom into one of them, this is what it would look like. So you have your housing, and then in the center you have your schools, your shopping. So he's kind of adapting the idea of the city for 3 million, where you come down to your zigzag and you have everything you need. And he's expanding it to the size of a block. So now you can live in a block, and you have everything you need within the block. So at least you get to go down to the ground level and walk a little bit more. At the top of Chandigarh, so in the head or the brains of the city, you have this little complex that has our assembly, our high courts, our legislation. And you can see that same kind of towers and park concept in this area. So the buildings he has for the head of Chandigarh are quite tall. So we have our Secretariat building back here. This is our assembly building up here. You zoom into it. You can see he's using his little T for the facade, for the plan, he's using the roof, right? So all of his ideas are still here. He's clearly marking the entryway over here. And I want you to notice the way he screens the building. So one of the great things about modernism at this time is that because they did not have mechanical systems like AC, they actually had to work with the elements, which I told you already before. But notice how he's doing it differently in India, where you have a much harsher climate than you have in France. So he's using these large screens which allow daylight to come in, but they also keep out a lot of the heat. So as sun is shining on those big pieces of concrete up there, it is collecting the heat, and then at night it releases it back into the environment, all while letting in diffuse daylight into those offices. This is the assembly building, and if you notice, there are two things kind of protruding from the top of it, and it is symbolic of the two chambers. So they are bicameral, so they are kind of like us, where we have our House of Representatives and our Senate. I don't know exactly what they call theirs, but they do have two of them, and they are marked visually by these two kind of protrusions on the rooftop. On the back side is, of course, the iconic shot, and he uses evaporative cooling techniques here. So evaporative cooling is basically when the wind comes, right? And as you know, water is always cooler or warmer than the temperature. It doesn't really heat up or cool down as quickly as air does. So in Vegas, usually water is going to be a lot cooler than the air temperature, meaning that when you have a breeze come in, it's going to pick up on the temperature of the water and bring it into the building. So it's a form of passive cooling, and because it's designed to have ventilation, you're pretty much going to cool it down by around 10 degrees just by having this body of water right there. He does have this massive shading canopy, so again, one of the things he's been critiqued on is he doesn't really pay attention to the human scale that much because he's focused on the larger idea. So it is quite monumental, it is very grand, it does cover this facade over here, but it also makes you feel very small, which in many ways is what you want for a government building, but in other ways alienates the citizen from its government. This is the High Court. So if you notice, the building itself is where all the High Court is, right, all of this piece down here. And then this thing on top is a ginormous canopy that's shading the building. So there's this concept that you have a building and then you put a roof over it. And it's usually used in the tropics to keep it a lot cooler because the harsh sunlight down there really heats it up a lot quicker. If you have this on top, then you're going to have this massive concrete roof absorbing all of that sunlight's heat, and then it radiates it back out at night before it ever reaches any of the places where people are living in all day. A really cool shot over here. So notice how he curves that out. So as the angle of the sun comes in on the high point, he's really blocking it out. And you can see, this is what we call egg crate technique. You can see those lines of shadow, right? So the sun is never ever going to directly reach inside of those units. But they are still going to be very well lit because he tends to paint the bottom of the light. So as the sunlight comes in, it bounces back into the office or house or whatever it is, and it illuminates it quite nicely. If you look through it, it does have a circulation very clearly outlined within it. So it's an outdoor circulation building, which goes in line with the Indian subcontinent, right? They have a lot of outdoor spaces. Typically, they have corner housing. So he really pays attention to the vernacular of this new region he's working in, and he just kind of imposes his own ideas onto it in Chandigarh. This is kind of a cheesy image, but since you guys have never seen Lucio Costa, I did want to show it to you just so you can have a visual. So he designs the new capital city of Brazil, which we call Brasilia. So Brazil traditionally is going to be most populated on the coasts because it was a ships coming in, so it makes sense to just kind of live on the coast. Which is why today most of the population still lives in Sao Paulo or Rio down here, or along any one of these coastal cities. But the interior of Brazil is traditionally not very populated, which means you don't have a very heavy hand when it comes to the government in those central areas. So Brazil wanted to change the way that was after the war, and they essentially relocated their capital to the interior of the country in hopes that industry, powerful, businessmen, that people would just follow the capital and move into the interior of the country. So they were trying to kind of create a more equal population on the interior and on the coast. Did it work? Not really. Most people still live on the coast today, but it did bring a great deal of attention to the interior of the country, which was previously largely ignored. So this is the design that Lúcio Costa comes up with. At this point, modernism is called the international style. So we see in Brazil and India, pretty much all over the world, they're picking up on modernism as a way to essentially modernize their countries and move forward after the war. Now, the scheme of it looks like an airplane. That is basically what he intended, a bird, an airplane, this kind of cross formation, where you have a huge government artery down this way, you have housing down this way, and then you have private housing over here. It was a huge project. A lot of this is artificially done. So because there was a body of water here, they did have transportation, not just through roads, but also through water. So that did come into the capital city. But they did also have to drain some parts to make this happen. They did have to carve out other parts to make other parts of this happen. So they did have to heavily manipulate the land. Now, in his plan, he does have two major arteries. So one of them is just a highway, and the other one is one of the commercial districts. This also fails in many ways. I'll show you in a second. Basically, the scale of it is also not friendly to people, and it imposed too heavily how people should live, and they didn't really like that. The other flaw of this plan, does anyone see a flaw in this plan? Let's see if anyone can get it. What would happen if the city grew double its size? Yeah, it's kind of a closed idea. You can't really expand upon it because the wings just kind of end here, right? You run into water issues, you ruin this perfect formation, the proportions of this airplane are ruined. So what you'll notice is when you look at it from the top down, you have all of these kind of extra areas that were added in, and they're not really a part of the original scheme. So it's a very difficult plan to work with compared to cores where you could just have zigzags go onto the ends of the earth. In this case, it has a particular shape, and you can't really just continue that on forever. This is what the center looks like. So lots of greenery, very open, but very much like Chandigarh or like any of these other modernist plans, it doesn't really have a friendly human scale, right? So you're right next to these enormous towers while you're on the road. You also have super wide roads, which again, generally isn't a good thing, doesn't make it pedestrian friendly. These are all the office buildings, back to back to back to back. The same thing over and over again along these huge roads. And you can see in this case, you don't even have trees in the center, so it's just a big open lawn, which doesn't make it very inviting given that Brazil is a country in the tropics that's going to have very strong solar heat rays. We're going to look at two buildings that we have. Number one, we have our Congress complex, which like Chandigarh does portray the two cameras. And then it has these huge office towers for all of the congressmen to have their offices in. Right, so very, very beautiful. Court was kind of involved in this. He did speak with Brazilian architects quite often. This was done by Niemeyer, right? So kind of like Dr. Claire, but slightly different. Niemeyer worked with Lúcio Costa, and he did the architecture of the city. Costa laid out the airplane urban plan. I think it's on your handout if you wanted to know more about him. But he's a very, very high ultra-modernist. He uses lots of glass, steel. He takes the pavilion to a whole new level. So this is what it looks like in plan. Again, you have your two Niemeyer is called the king of the curve in architecture, so we have him being the king of the curve, and then, Zaha Hadid's work, she is the queen of the curve. There's another view of it. We do have a ramp that goes onto the roof, but unlike Forbes, the roof isn't really meant to be used. They just kind of have lights to illuminate these areas over here, exhausts. It's more utilitarian than it is usable for people. However, there was a recent protest there, I believe in 2023. There was a president in Brazil, Bolsonaro, and I believe the story was something like he lost the election, he went over to Florida, and then he told them to go storm the Congress, which you can see them doing here, and then they got all over the roof. They did break a lot of the panels, they did crack a lot of the concrete, so it was a really bad day for modernist design. You can see how thin these slabs are, so they can't really support that weight. They're not really meant to do that, right? And then we also have the President's National Palace, which also underwent lots of damages under this particular president. So you can see it's this, again, ultra-modernist kind of glass box sitting on these concrete stilts. So again, Niemeyer's using curves, hence his name as the king of the curve. Here we have this beautiful ramp entry, which in this case is usable. So this is basically the White House of Brazil, which is super cool, right? They have this ultra-modernist mansion for the president. You just get to live here if you win the elections. That being said, the president is for a president. You'll see that the scale of it is not very cozy. It is very official looking, right? So you're meant to have dinners, you're meant to host ambassadors, you're meant to host parties here. It's not really meant to be a home for a family. This is what the interior looks like. So you can see the scale of it is quite large, right? The staircase is kind of wrapped in red carpet, which does make it look quite royal almost. And then this is what the dinner table looks like. So very, very, very large to seat a large amount of people if they're ever visiting the president's home. So under the same president that kind of made people go storm Congress, lots of artwork did go missing. So traditionally you are handed over the house with all of this important artwork to Brazil. A lot of it went missing and it was never recovered, so he essentially stole it. And then there were a lot of tapestries that he moved because he didn't like them. He put them in the sun, and they were basically permanently ruined, so they do have to undergo restoration. They did also find a lot of stains on the wood, on the carpet, on the finishes, and again, all of this is designer furniture that was made in the classic modernist era, so they are kind of a part of national heritage, and now they have to be restored. So just an unfortunate day, or kind of 4 years for architecture in Brazil. Now back to this plan, I did mention that along these lines over here, we do have the living spaces for people, right? So people are meant to live along these wings. And this is what those individual blocks look like. So you do have these long buildings similar to Bonita, except for the fact that you don't really have amenities on the roof. You just kind of live in apartment blocks. And then you're meant to go shopping within your own blocks. So you're not really meant to leave it. Everything you need is within there, which again is a problem because let's say the person over here that's selling groceries has broccoli and the person over here does not have broccoli. You would have to leave your own block to go to this block, and in the same way that if you leave your block, other people are going to leave their blocks, and that becomes a supply issue because then you can't really sell enough to keep these shops open, right? Because your people that are supposed to be supporting your business over here are leaving to go support another business. It just doesn't really work when you have competition this close to each other. So instead, the people of Brazil basically took over this plan and they created a huge commercial district along with the highways. So it's more in the line of traditional Brazilian cities where you have commerce all on one big road, and then people just live in these more like sneaky bedroom blocks over here. So there isn't a mixing of living and then commerce. It doesn't traditionally work that well because you just don't have enough people living within that block to support a whole supermarket, right? If you think about it in American terms, you're not about to have Walmarts in every single one of these. It just doesn't make sense. You're going to have one Walmart, and then everyone for like a 50-block radius has to go to that one slot. I forgot to add an image here. is the guy that created the Salk Institute. He's the one that famously asked the question, what does the building want to be, right? So he shifts that idea of imposing a program, and he believes that the program should be imposed onto the architecture instead. So we're going to see what he does in Bangladesh. Again, remember India does splits, and one of those new countries to the east is Bangladesh, which is a Muslim country. And so he creates this new plan for what the center of it is going to look like. Traditionally, this area floods very quickly. This is kind of farmer land, and it floods with things like rice production. So what he does is he takes the water, he creates these water basins, and he creates a assembly kind of government area over here, and then a cultural center over here. This part was never built, so we're just going to be looking at this for today. It looks like this, which looks very much like Louis Kahn architecture, very geometric, and if you notice, it does have this kind of vertical extrusion to it. All of these are little pavilions. So basically, if you are in the Congress, right, or this assembly, you live over on the left, you have these kind of 5, 6 units like living over there. Then you have hospitals, shopping, retail, you have all these amenities over here. It's essentially a mini city for the government of Bangladesh. And in the center is, of course, the actual government hall. Notice that every single one of these pieces is unique in plan, right? So this is more of a cube. This one is like 2 cubes. This one is like a cube with circles around it. And each one of them is completely unique around the edges. So again, what does the building want to be? What does each one of these functions want to look like as it gets extruded? The reason we have so many of these cutouts is one, he's really into geometry, but two, he pays attention to the planets. So when you have very harsh sun, when it's very hot, it's very humid, you do need to screen your facades off. So the facades for most of this are very recessed. So those cutouts, though they look very dark, allow plenty of daylight and again evaporative cooling to come in so that your assembly chambers don't have to have as much mechanical equipment in them. Alright, this is what it looks like in plan. So again, each one of these is completely unique. The floor plan tells you so. And you can see that from the outside, you see those extrusions that are also telling you in elevation. So if you want to look at it in more detail, this is kind of a breakdown so you can see why each of them looks that way. But basically this part down here, the square with the rounded corners, this is going to be a mosque. So again, this is a Muslim country. They're going to have a mosque in the government center. And the very heart of it is, of course, the assembly chamber, but you're also going to have small offices, tea rooms, you know. Again, they were ruled by Britain for a long time, and tea and chai are still very important, so they have a whole tea room in there. They have a press room, prayer hall, circulation, public galleries for people to come in, and each one of those manifests itself differently. So this is a really cool section, right? So we have our assembly in the center over here, plenty of daylight pouring in from the top. Over here is our prayer hall, so notice that it is diffused light. At no point do you get direct sunlight just shining into there. You cover it completely. You open up your corners. I'll show you an image in a second. And the way in which he manipulates daylight is masterful here. This is the main entrance, so when you come in, you're kind of put into this labyrinth or maze of circles and ramps going everywhere. And it's all diffused daylight. So this is the assembly hall itself, which looks like this, heavy concrete, right? Notice that at the top of it, we have this kind of star formation. This is what it looks like, so it's kind of a callback to the mosque shapes. But if you look at the way that he's manipulating the daylight again, notice that it does have this whole flat roof covering it, but then because it bounces inside of these chambers, it does come back in a very diffused way. And because the concrete is very light, it allows it to bounce off a lot quicker. And essentially, it illuminates all of this using no artificial lighting. This is the outside of the mosque right here, right? And these towers do have a very particular function that I'll show you in a second. So this is what it looks like inside. This is not a window to the outdoors. So basically, when you're standing in one of these corners, you're looking into this big concrete cylinder that's around you, right? So we're standing right here in the image, and you're looking out into a concrete cylinder, and And what that does is it allows the light to enter through those cylinders and then bounce back with the white color of the concrete into the mosque space itself. So all of that is just a concrete cylinder outside, and it allows diffuse daylight, which is perfect for a mosque without letting it heat up very much, and it provides concentration because you don't necessarily have views of the exterior. So another view of it so you can see it a little bit better. And of course it does have its niche towards Mecca, so it still has all the basic parts of the mosque. This is the entrance over here. This is where you enter, and you just have to navigate your way through here. But again, notice all of the screen facades that he's using, not just in this main assembly hall, but also in the living quarters and the medical areas. He uses brick to differentiate them, but he does use the same techniques. Right. And now the last one we're going to talk about is a super American concept. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's. So Frank Lloyd Wright has this concept called Broadacre City. And this is a kind of tapestry that shows us what his vision is. Now, it kind of looks like a kind of countryside, farm village. It's because it kind of is. For Frank Lloyd Wright, he was the ultimate kind of American, and typically Americans are just not into urbanism in the same way that Europeans are. So whereas, Ford and Tony Garnier were doing these super dense urbanist ideas, Frank Lloyd Wright was quite the opposite. He wanted a more decentralized area in which every person has a whole acre of land, and on that acre of land they can have their house and they're going to have a farm, so they feed themselves. So it's this very Jeffersonian idea. Thomas Jefferson did believe every man should have his own farm and have his own subsistence farming. So we have our orchard district, school districts. I'll get into it in a second. But I did tell you to keep this in the back of your mind. So remember, Ford has this image, putting these architects' hands on you how to live. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright recreates this image, right? So he not only creates Broadacres as a response to the city of Blue Mill because he hates it so much, but it also mocks LaFleur by creating this image with his own hands, kind of imposing on the landscape. Doesn't actually mean it. He's just taking a photograph so that it gets back to Ford, just to kind of provoke him. All right, so this is the basic units of Broadacre, and the idea is once you have enough people to live in this area, you can just expand it infinitely. So then it can look like that, right, and then eventually it can look like that, and so forth. It just goes over and over and over, and it's all connected by this highway up here. So notice that we do have this huge arterial highway. So if you've ever been out to Central California, to places like Fresno, you know there's a huge highway that just goes through all these little agricultural towns. That would have been Frank Lloyd Wright's basic vision of what the United States should be, except for the fact that farms should be in the city. So you're going to see he does have a lot of tension between trying to create the city of the future and have urbanist ideas, but trying to retain ideas from the past in which he has farmlands. So the basic unit is a 1 mile radius. And in that 1 mile, we have all of these things inside of it. So you have a school, you have a park, you have a shopping center. Basically, you don't have to leave that mile block. And you'll notice that's a recurring theme for modernists, right? They want to make it so easy for you to live in that they give you everything in that singular block. But that's just not the way that people like to live. So, if you have elementary schools, you have 1, 2, 3. If you have middle schools, you might have 1, 2. And if you want a high school, you have 1 of them. So it is very dependent on this 1 mile unit, right? So a high school you don't need as often, meaning that you could skip a couple blocks, have 1 per block. In elementary school, you need more often. So that's why you have to keep this repetitive unit over and over again. And then this is what one of those cities would look like. And eventually, if you outgrow this, you just add another one next to it that has its own game, recreation, market, tourist camp, lake, arena area, and you just repeat it infinitely. So for Frank Lloyd Wright, if the whole of the United States was just this, that would be perfect for him. And again, you can see a little bit of that tension going on. So on the one hand, we have orchards and vineyards, but then we also have flying wants to preserve the farmland, and so to do that, he has to create towers. So he has this kind of dichotomy that he's not perfectly comfortable with, but it is the question of the 20th century. How should we be building? What should the future look like? This is what he believes cars are going to look like in the future. So he thought they were going to be these crystal bubbles, and then this would be the body of the car and have these huge, enormous wheels, right? And then he had this very interesting concept of how can we live in a city that doesn't have stoplights or stop signs, and it's pretty much just going to have seamless traffic the whole time. So the idea is, right, if you're coming in on this road, you can cross over the intersection at the top or the bottom, and then the through road can just come through straight. And notice that pedestrians get their own little space right here on either side, which again, in theory seems good because you're keeping people safe, but in practice, it doesn't always work. That's a very dark and long tunnel to walk in as a singular pedestrian. It's not really the best place to be in.
Great place to get involved. Great place to get involved.
Yeah. Now, again, Broadacre City, like most of these, did not get constructed, but we do have in Marin County, California, one building that he designs, which he believes could easily be integrated into Broadacre. So like Corbusier, if Franklin Wright had been given an entire city and told design it any way you wish, this would have been a part of it. This would have been the government center. So once again, we see long, linear, horizontal, playing with landscape. Low entry points, right? So all of the signature Franklin Wright moves are there. But then when you look at it, the scale of it is very unnerving. It is enormous, and it goes over this entire valley, which you have a whole highway crossing underneath it, right, seamlessly. So the building is just kind of existing over the land without really touching down on certain points. And that isn't necessarily a comfortable way to build architecture either, because again, if you're standing right here, if you look up, it's just too tall, it gives people vertigo. If you're standing on the one end of that, it makes you feel very small, right? It makes you feel like these buildings are never ending. You're a very small part of this huge world. That's not necessarily the feeling that you want to create as an architect. So to conclude, these are kind of the 6 that we looked at, so you can answer number 5. No right or wrong answer, but just kind of choose the lesser of the evils that you would want to live in, because obviously they all have their little kind of things they need to work out. Personally, I think I would choose Tony Guardio's City Industrial. I just think it seems really nice, 1 story, living in parks. Corpse doesn't seem like a bad idea, but it's just the idea of everything looking the same, the cars always being on the same level, that's kind of weird. Chandigarh seems cool in theory, but again, you have this massive architecture, so maybe Chandigarh would be my second choice. Brasilia, remember the problem was expansion for that one, and in fact they have Walmarts and every other corner that don't work. Dhaka is largely for assembly, so if you're looking to become a politician, Dhaka is your city of choice. And then Broadacre. If you're into farming, if you're into more about rural kind of setting, but within an urban setting, you would choose Broadacre. By show of hands, how many of you chose number 1? Okay. How many of you chose Quartz number 2? Okay. How many of you chose Chandigarh? Alright. How many of you chose Brasilia? Dhaka? And then Broadacre. Okay. So it seems like Broadacre is quite popular, which makes sense. We are in the States.